Good morning. Today's July the 26th. Thanks for joining me for this online sermon. I'm reading today from the 13th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus loved to tell stories. That was his way of teaching. I happen to admire that model of pedagogy. I like to tell stories too. Jesus, Matthew tells us, had just come out of the house and he was standing beside the lake, and there were great crowds that had gathered around him. He got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach, and he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil. As he sowed, some fell on the path. Some sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, since they had no root. They withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." And he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples approached him, and they said, "Explain to us that story you told." And Jesus said, "Well, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of his kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned with the fire, so it'll be with the end of the age," Jesus said. "The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and evildoers, and throw them in the furnace of fire, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen," Jesus said. Well, Charlotte and I planted 12 hills of squash this spring, zucchini and summer squash. Next year it will be one hill, if I have anything to do with it. And we planted these tiny little seeds in what had at one time been a raspberry patch. And it threatens to be a raspberry patch once again. Frankly, I would rather have a raspberry patch in my garden than zucchini and summer squash. But if I reveal too much more of my feelings there, I would be trespassing on a marital conflict that I most likely need to keep confidential. But anyone who does or ever has done gardening, you know some of the challenges you face. In our case, sprouting raspberry shoots in the midst of a prolific squash vines. There's always the complementary crabgrass that has much in common with Superman, growing faster than a speeding bullet. And there's nutgrass that comes to a head and produces stick-tight type seed heads by the billions. We have clover in the squash patch, and a dandelion edging. And then we've recently discovered that there are grasshoppers that have taken up residency. If I convey to you a sense of frustration in the consideration or the avocation of gardening, you would not be misunderstanding me. But for some reason, I just keep on planting every year without fail. There's always something growing at our house, and I take great satisfaction in helping to make that happen. The weeds start popping up. I get out my hoe and I start cultivating the ground to give the optimal chances for the survival of the intended crop that we've planted. I start cultivating, I said. And I chose that verb with intentionality, cultivate. What exactly does it mean to cultivate? Think about that with me for a minute. It's an agricultural word, to be sure. I can well remember cultivating cornfields when I was a kid occasionally, and cultivating a soybean field maybe. In the agricultural world, to cultivate is to open the ground up, to remove the weeds, making the soil able to absorb the water and the air in order that the soil will bring forth the greatest yield of whatever's been planted. It's that simple. I like to think of it as breaking up the clods. And I'm cautious about anthropomorphizing that clod analogy as I seek to lead us in reflecting on the meaning of Jesus' parable that we just read. I don't think Jesus was implying that any of us are clods, really. But I do believe the master teacher was referring to the cultivation process that needs to be a part of every faithful person's spiritual discipline. I absolutely love the masterful teaching technique he used, not only here in this instance, but over and over again, according to the gospel writers. The story is most frequently referred to, as I said, as Jesus' parable of the sower. Imagine this scene. Here's what I think was happening. He's out on the shore, the Sea of Galilee. It's kind of an open-air chapel at the beach, if you will. The leaders of the synagogue are no longer welcoming Jesus in their places of worship. So he decides to turn to any open-air chapel that he can find by the seashore, on the roadside, or in a cornfield, or at a community well, wherever people were. That was the location of the classroom for Jesus. And on this particular instance, the classroom is the beach. Not a bad place to provide an educational opportunity, unless it's during a pandemic, as they have so tragically learned the hard way in Florida. But folks weren't fearful of the virus in those days, so there were scores of people who had gathered around the rabbi. It was a crowd, Matthew tells us. There were so many people in the assembly that Jesus found it necessary to get out in the boat and then look back at the people to teach them that day. And here's what I think happened. Looking off to a nearby hillside, and by the way, I've been on the Sea of Galilee, so I know what it looks like there. I can imagine Jesus saw a man sowing seed on the ground that had been prepared, cultivated, if you will. It was most likely a simple Bedouin peasant, a farmer, out doing his seasonal chore. Every good farmer knows that if you want to reap a harvest in the fall, as Kansas farmers will be doing in a few short months, then you have to carefully plant the seeds in the springtime. So Jesus sees this farmer out there sowing his seed, and that's all it took. The farmer planting his seed became the text out of which Jesus would weave a story. In a nutshell, Jesus is teaching a profound truth with this parable. His point: when a farmer tosses his seed into the air like that guy's doing over there on the hillside, scattering seed recklessly like that, it's inevitable that some of that seed's going to fall on the ground that's not adequately prepared. Perhaps the path that people walk on. Chances are, when the birds discover those seeds, they're going to swoop down and have a feast, right? Furthermore, says the master teacher, some of that seed that's being tossed out so recklessly will inevitably fall on rocky ground. Chances are, Jesus explained, that seed may not germinate, but if it does, there'll be no roots. And the hot, drying summer sun will scorch the tender, underrooted plants, and they'll kick off and die. Some of the seeds will fall in ground where weeds will take over, or raspberry bushes. And they choke out the tender young plants and they will die. But what this master teacher wants his students to notice is how this guy over in the hillside has cultivated his ground. Some of his seed is falling in that cultivated ground, and assuming that it gets the proper nutrition and the rains come and give it its needed water, assuming all those things, those seeds are going to germinate and they're going to grow, and new grain will come forth 100 times more than that tiny seed that was planted. He who has ears, Jesus said, let that person hear. Obviously, as an addicted gardener, I find it easy to identify with this story that Jesus tells the crowds that have come to hear his teaching. They could identify with his points too, because my guess is most of them were farmers, horticulturalists in the most primitive sense of the word. You know, the subject of Jesus' teaching really had nothing whatsoever to do with how to get the best yield out of your harvest. The one central truth that Jesus was seeking to establish with his listeners is this: our God is a lavishly loving God, throwing out love, mercy, grace, possibility. So much like that farmer out there is just tossing seeds in the air. There's a kind of recklessness about God's tossing out seeds to us. Just think about where it lands. Over and over again, mercy and grace is tossed out to us as possibilities. It's tossed out to folks who have done absolutely no soil preparation, no personal spiritual cultivation to make ready to provide for a climate wherein the gift may grow, wherein the seed may take root. Seems to me that the real central truth conveyed in the story of Jesus' parable of the sower is this: when God recklessly and lavishly tosses out God's abundant grace, we, you and I, the folks standing on the shore side, we have a multiple choice in how we can respond. And the only way we respond faithfully to allow the seeds of God's mercy and love to grow is that our ground has to be cultivated. The clods have to be broken up. So how does this cultivation happen for Christians? Let's just say it doesn't happen overnight. But you know, one of my observations of growing up on a farm and being a part of my family's agribusiness, where I talked to farmers every day, saw them in our office, sold them their binding twine, baler twine, and their cow feed, and their dog feed, and their chicken feed. One of my epiphanies in growing up in that environment was farmers have to be the most patient human beings in the entire world. They plant seeds as soon as the ground warms up enough in the early spring. And then they have to wait until late fall, most of the time, before they bring in the harvest. But in between time, they have to cultivate the ground. And you know, the seeds of spiritual growth are just like that. Seeds are planted every day, all the time, in you. Opportunities, God's grace, compassion. And sometimes we stumble. Sometimes we head off in the wrong direction. And it is through all of those stumblings and strugglings that God takes us from the seed stage of our faith to the fruit-bearing stages. Pastor T.J. Jakes says in one of his books that I'm enjoying reviewing right now, he says, let go of whatever burdens of regret that you may harbor in your heart. The failed relationships, lost opportunities, wasted money, unhealthy lifestyle choices, reckless decisions that you may have made. Surrender them. Give it up. And just trust that those things happen for a reason you may never understand, but you must still accept they are part of your journey. Yes. And be aware that God continues to throw out those possibilities, recklessly tossing out possibilities and opportunities for you to grow, especially in these dark times. If we allow it, God will break us up like a farmer does with a cultivator, giving us new possibilities. God continues to cultivate us even when we're not totally aware. I'll never forget the day my dad added a new addition to his collection of farming implements. I was just a little guy. And I remember asking my dad, "What is that thing, Dad?" His reply, "It's a manure spreader, Jimmy," he said. "A what spreader?" I said. I mean, I was a vastly inexperienced little kid. Certainly not old enough to understand the mysteries of the process of fertilization in the average piece of farm acreage, but I was also old enough to have visited any number of pig lots and cow pens, and I could not for the life of me understand how it was that anything that smelled that bad could ever do anything redemptive to anything. But my dad said it would. Dad said, well, it works like fertilizer. It makes the grass turn green, if you spread it thin enough, that is. It feeds the land. Dad said it makes the grass grow that we cut and then bale into hay bales. You know what? I'm not a lot smarter than I was when I was a little kid. I still don't understand how something that smells that bad could do anything that good. But I do know that some of the things that almost smell that bad in our lives can sometimes end up doing the very same thing, bringing about the most optimum growth, the defining moments, the greatest fertilization, bringing new depth to our spiritual formation. I look back on my life and I think, you know what? It's the dark moments that made me grow the most. The defining moments that I look back on, that was the growing experience. It was Jesus who once said, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Dark places, don't let them get you off track. Don't let them derail your growth. God's throwing out seeds of possibility, mercy, grace, opportunity. And remember this, God is not finished with you yet. You're a seed that has been designed to sprout, just like the squash have done in my garden. And I don't care if you're 9 years old or if you're 99 years old. Be patient with yourself and with everyone around you. Give yourself space to be cultivated. Oh, and by the way, does anybody need a zucchini squash? Amen.